The story begins with a sense of unease that hangs over the quiet streets of Edinburgh in 1871. On an unremarkable morning, a letter is discovered, addressed in a meticulous hand, yet carrying a message that defies comprehension. The words are precise, unerringly coherent, yet they come from a source no longer among the living. News of this letter spreads slowly at first, whispered between neighbors and read aloud in hushed tones by curious townsfolk. The shock is immediate and visceral. How could a man who had died only days before have written these words? The document becomes a focal point, drawing the attention of scholars, clergy, and ordinary citizens alike, all attempting to reconcile the impossible with the mundane. The letter itself is simple in appearance, a sheet of paper, yellowed with age, creased from handling, its ink slightly faded but unmistakable in clarity. The words, however, speak of events that could not have been known by anyone except the deceased, detailing minute details about his own death, observations of those around him, and cryptic warnings that unsettle even the most rational mind. As neighbors read the text, a chill passes through them, not merely from the contents, but from the realization that something incomprehensible has entered their lives. Those who had known him personally cannot ignore the familiarity of the handwriting. It is unmistakably his, yet impossible. The very authenticity of the physical object clashes with the natural laws that govern life and death. Word of the letter reaches the local post office, where clerks examine it with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Some suggest it is a prank, a forgery perhaps, yet their skepticism falters in the presence of certain details, the description of objects in the deceased's home, small personal notes that only someone intimately familiar could know, the timing that seems impossible for any human hand to have accomplished. Rumors begin to circulate. Some claim the deceased had anticipated his own demise and meticulously prepared the letters beforehand. Others whisper of dark arts or supernatural intervention. Edinburgh, already a city steeped in superstition and hidden histories, is primed for such a story to take root and flourish. The emotional impact on the local population is immediate. Families who once passed each other on the cobblestones without a second glance now discuss the letter with quiet fear. Children are hushed when adults mention it. Shopkeepers glance nervously at one another, exchanging unspoken questions about the boundaries of life, death, and knowledge. The tension grows in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. People begin to notice shadows where there were none, hear footsteps behind them that disappear when they turn, and feel the weight of unseen eyes. The letter becomes more than paper, it transforms into a symbol of uncertainty, a touchstone for fear that spreads like a slow, invasive fog. The man himself becomes an enigma in life and death. His character, previously unremarkable, is now re-examined in light of the letters. Friends and acquaintances recount stories that suddenly seem significant, habits that now appear prophetic, conversations that hinted at hidden knowledge, behaviors that suggest premonition. Every detail, no matter how minor, is scrutinized. Scholars attempt to compare handwriting samples from his known correspondences, seeking inconsistencies, yet find none. The precision, the personal nuances, and the timing all point toward an unsettling reality. These messages could only have been produced by the man himself, yet he is unquestionably deceased. Local newspapers catch wind of the story, their ink capturing both facts and speculation. Headlines are careful but undeniably dramatic, hinting at the supernatural without committing outright to disbelief or belief. Letters to the editors pour in, some dismissive, some fearful, all contributing to a rising tide of public fascination. Those who read the accounts feel compelled to see the letter in person. Small gatherings form outside the man's former residence, neighbors exchanging stories and theories. Some of these accounts conflict wildly, blending imagination with observation, creating a patchwork of truth and fear. The immediate family is plunged into emotional turmoil. Grief, already a raw wound, is compounded by the impossibility of the letters. They struggle to reconcile the knowledge that their loved one is gone with the undeniable evidence of his posthumous communication. Some are skeptical, believing the letters to be elaborate hoaxes, while others are paralyzed by the fear that they may be witnessing something beyond comprehension. Arguments arise, suspicions flare, and the once close household begins to fracture under the weight of uncertainty and dread. Meanwhile, curiosity draws outsiders, scholars from the city's universities, amateur detectives, and those with an interest in the occult. They examine the letters with magnifying glasses, chemical tests, and careful observation. Each method, however, fails to provide conclusive answers. The ink is consistent with contemporary methods, the paper matches the period, and there is no evidence of forgery. This meticulous scrutiny only heightens the tension, as every rational explanation is dismantled, leaving the mystery intact and the emotional intensity unrelenting. As night falls over Edinburgh, the streets grow quiet, cloaked in fog that seems almost sentient. The story of the letter becomes part of the city's whispered conversations, carried along the alleys and through the gaslit streets. People walk home cautiously, feeling as if unseen hands brush past them. Some claim to see shadows moving against the walls, hear faint voices repeating words from the letter. The psychological impact is undeniable, fear and wonder intertwine, and the boundaries between reality and imagination blur. The city itself becomes a character, its narrow passages and hidden courtyards amplifying every unease. By the end of this opening section, the audience is fully immersed in the story's central enigma. The letter has established the stakes, a man is speaking from beyond the grave, leaving behind a puzzle that challenges reason, evokes fear, and captures the imagination. The tone is set, the atmosphere is suffocating yet compelling, and the stage is prepared for the unfolding narrative of investigation, psychological tension, and historical intrigue. The audience is left with an urgent question: how is it possible for these messages to exist, and what consequences will arise as the truth is pursued? The chilling letter is no longer a mere object, it is the catalyst for the story that will follow, drawing every character, and the viewer, into its slow-burning mystery. Edinburgh in the year 1871 was a city of contrasts, a place where grandeur and squalor existed side by side, where the echoes of history lingered in every cobblestone and shadow. The city's skyline was punctuated by the Gothic spires of its churches, the imposing silhouette of Edinburgh Castle atop Castle Rock, and the dense, narrow tenements that housed the working classes. Gas lamps flickered in the evenings, casting long, wavering shadows that made familiar streets seem unfamiliar and sinister. Fog rolled in from the Firth of Forth, curling through alleys and courtyards, muffling footsteps and swallowing voices, lending an ever-present veil of mystery over daily life. In this environment, tales of the unexplained, the uncanny, and the macabre found fertile ground. The social hierarchy of Edinburgh was sharply defined, with the wealthy elite inhabiting the elegant streets of New Town, their lives structured around appearances, propriety, and education. In contrast, the Old Town was densely packed, dark, and labyrinthine, home to tradesmen, laborers, and artisans who eked out a living amid cramped and often unsanitary conditions. In these neighborhoods, stories circulated with rapidity, passed from neighbor to neighbor in candlelit rooms, often taking on layers of exaggeration and superstition with each retelling. Folklore, ghost stories, and warnings about spirits or the supernatural were not mere entertainment but part of the cultural fabric, influencing how individuals interpreted unusual events or coincidences. The intellectual climate of the city was equally complex. Edinburgh had long been a center of learning and scientific inquiry, home to prominent universities and medical institutions. Physicians and scholars pursued knowledge with rigor, yet their work existed alongside deep-seated superstition and religious orthodoxy. The tension between emerging scientific methods and traditional belief systems was palpable, shaping public reception of phenomena that defied explanation. In such an environment, a seemingly impossible letter could ignite debate across multiple spheres, the rational and the irrational, the scholarly and the common, the spiritual and the empirical. Daily life in Edinburgh during this period was marked by routines that reflected both necessity and social expectation. Market stalls bustled in the early morning, delivering produce, meat, and fish to households across the city. Craftsmen honed their trades in shadowed workshops, while clerks, scholars, and professionals navigated the rigid expectations of work, propriety, and intellectual discourse. Social gatherings, church services, and public lectures offered both recreation and instruction, reinforcing hierarchies while providing spaces for ideas and rumors to circulate. Within this structure, news of the mysterious letter would travel, not just as information, but as a psychological contagion, slowly infiltrating every level of society. The man at the center of the story existed within this multifaceted city, shaped by its contradictions and contradictions of its inhabitants. He was neither elite nor destitute, belonging to a class of educated professionals whose lives straddled the lines of propriety, curiosity, and social obligation. His home, modest yet orderly, reflected both his attention to detail and a preoccupation with precision that would later manifest in the letters. Neighbors recalled him as a quiet, meticulous figure, respected for his intellect yet regarded with a mild suspicion born of the city's ingrained wariness of eccentricity. The setting of Edinburgh, with its intertwining histories and dense social fabric, both framed and amplified the mystery of the letters, making ordinary streets and homes seem charged with anticipation and latent dread. Within these streets and alleys, ordinary events could take on extraordinary significance. A candle flickering in a window might suggest an unseen presence. A distant scream or shout could be interpreted as a harbinger of doom. The population, well versed in tales of ghostly apparitions, vanished persons, and unexplained phenomena, was primed to perceive the unusual and magnify it. When news of the posthumous letter surfaced, these predispositions shaped reactions: fear, fascination, and speculation intertwined, each reinforcing the other. The city itself became a participant in the narrative, its architecture, weather, and social structure, amplifying the psychological tension that would envelop the story. The year 1871 was also a time of change and uncertainty, both locally and globally. Advances in science and industry coexisted uneasily with lingering superstition and religious authority. Edinburgh's citizens experienced the tension of modernity pressing against tradition, the allure of rational thought tempered by fear of the unknown. In such a context, the letters attributed to the deceased man were more than a curiosity, they were a challenge to the very foundations of belief, morality, and perception. Every observer, from the street vendor to the university scholar, had to confront the possibility that something beyond comprehension had intruded into the ordered routines of their lives. Daily social interactions became colored by this tension. Conversations carried undercurrents of dread, markets, pubs, and meeting halls buzzed with speculation. Parents cautioned their children to listen and observe, whispering about caution and propriety in response to rumors. Clergy discussed the phenomenon in sermons, framing the event as either a moral lesson or a test of faith, while academics debated in private the limits of knowledge and rationality. This intricate web of social, intellectual, and emotional currents made Edinburgh not just a backdrop but an active, reactive entity, responding to and shaping the narrative of the mysterious letters. The city's physical spaces mirrored these tensions. Narrow alleyways and hidden courtyards became stages for the imagination, while grand halls and lecture rooms offered forums for debate and reflection. Fog, rain, and the dim glow of gas lamps cast shadows that suggested secrets lurking around every corner. Residents began to see patterns and connections where none might exist, projecting fear and expectation onto the environment. The streets, buildings, and public spaces acted almost as characters themselves, influencing perception and heightening suspense, creating a palpable sense of foreboding that would follow the audience throughout the unfolding events. By the end of this section, Edinburgh is presented as a living, breathing entity, a city poised between rationality and superstition, history and modernity, life and the suggestion of death. Its streets, institutions, and citizens are all integral to understanding the mystery that has begun to unfold. The audience is fully immersed in the setting, sensing both the grandeur and the menace that pervade the city. The stage is set for the mysterious letters to exert their influence, not only over the immediate characters but over the city itself, drawing every observer into a narrative shaped by tension, history, and the unknowable. The backdrop of Edinburgh is now inseparable from the story, ensuring that the suspense, mystery, and psychological complexity of the tale will resonate against a rich, historically grounded canvas. Before the man's death, subtle and inexplicable events began to accumulate around him, unnoticed at first by anyone beyond his immediate household. Small disturbances appeared in his study, papers rearranged in ways he had not left them, ink smudges forming patterns that seemed intentional yet elusive, and faint scratches along the edges of his desk. Servants occasionally reported hearing whispered words when the room was empty, or footsteps pacing softly across the wooden floor late at night. These occurrences were easily dismissed at first, explained as drafts, fatigue, or the imagination of those who worked in the house. Yet as they continued, they began to form a pattern that could not be so easily rationalized. Neighbors and acquaintances, when invited into his home, noticed minor anomalies as well. Candles flickered despite the absence of wind, shadows shifted at odd angles, and objects that were carefully placed seemed to move ever so slightly between visits. Friends who conversed with him described moments where he appeared distracted, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. These behaviors, though subtle, began to erode confidence in his ordinary appearance. People sensed that something unusual had taken root, though none could articulate its nature. The tension was quiet at first, a whisper in the background of everyday life, yet it carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Early correspondence from him revealed peculiar patterns. Letters written to acquaintances included cryptic sentences or phrases that seemed inconsequential at first glance but took on a disturbing resonance in retrospect. A mention of unfinished business or things yet to be seen seemed benign when first read, yet later, in light of the posthumous messages, these lines acquired a foreboding significance. Scholars examining his writing noted subtle irregularities, pauses and emphases that differed from his usual style, a precision bordering on obsession. This meticulousness hinted at preparation, perhaps the conscious construction of a legacy intended to unsettle and confound. Among his immediate family, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the anomalies as signs of stress or fatigue, others felt a growing unease that could not be explained by reason alone. Nights were marked by restlessness, with family members reporting vivid dreams, sudden chills, and a sense of being watched. The psychological impact began to extend beyond mere observation of peculiarities, influencing emotions, sleep, and social interactions. Household routines, once predictable and secure, were subtly disrupted by a lingering apprehension that something beyond understanding was unfolding under their roof. Local observers also played a role in amplifying the tension. Servants, neighbors, and casual visitors reported sightings and experiences that varied in credibility but shared common threads: faint voices, moving shadows, and inexplicable sounds emanating from the house. Each retelling added new details, intentional or not, creating a network of narrative threads that fed suspicion and anxiety. Rumors spread beyond the immediate vicinity, reaching distant acquaintances and fueling speculation. The collective imagination of the city, already steeped in folklore and superstition, began to weave these reports into a pattern that suggested more than mere coincidence. Scientific minds of the day attempted to find rational explanations for these events. Drafts, structural settling of the building, and the natural expansion and contraction of materials were proposed as possible causes for the moving objects and shifting shadows. Yet these explanations failed to account for the timing, the consistency, and the specificity of the disturbances. The combination of physical anomalies, behavioral oddities, and seemingly precognitive elements presented a puzzle that defied conventional reasoning. Even the most skeptical observers began to acknowledge the strangeness of the phenomenon, though they remained unwilling to concede to supernatural implications. A particularly unsettling moment occurred when one of his personal journals was found open on a desk, pages marked with symbols and notations that made little sense at the time. The symbols did not correspond to known ciphers or codes, yet their repetition suggested a deliberate system. Scholars and linguists attempted to decode the markings, some hypothesizing that they were intended for posthumous communication. The idea seemed preposterous, yet the precision with which the markings were executed, and their correlation to later letters, suggested foresight and intent. The early signs were no longer merely strange, they hinted at a mind operating according to a plan that extended beyond death. Accounts from visitors and acquaintances began to converge on a troubling theme: the man appeared to be preparing for something that no one could fully comprehend. The meticulousness of his habits, the intensity of his focus on certain objects, and the cryptic nature of his conversations suggested a consciousness attuned to events beyond immediate perception. Ordinary explanations, fatigue, eccentricity, or anxiety, were insufficient. The narrative tension grew as each anomaly layered upon the next, creating a cumulative effect that unsettled both witnesses and investigators. By the time of his death, the first strange signs had established a foundation of doubt and unease. The house itself, once merely a residence, became a locus of anxiety, its rooms and corridors imbued with anticipation and suspicion. Neighbors, friends, and scholars alike were left questioning the limits of human understanding. Could these anomalies be dismissed as coincidence, or were they the deliberate opening act of something far more extraordinary? The first strange signs were no longer isolated incidents, they formed a prelude to the extraordinary letters that would soon emerge, creating suspense, mystery, and a sense of foreboding that would grip Edinburgh and all who learned of the events. The moment the letters began circulating, whispers spread like wildfire through the narrow streets and alleyways of Edinburgh. At first, the murmurs were confined to those closest to the man, neighbors who had seen him in passing, servants who had worked in his home, and friends who had maintained casual correspondence. Yet it did not take long for the story to escape these immediate circles, carried along by curiosity, fear, and the irresistible allure of the inexplicable. Each person who repeated the tale added their own interpretation, emphasizing certain details, omitting others, and coloring the events with personal bias. The result was a network of speculation that grew denser and more unsettling with each passing day. In pubs and markets, the story took on new life. Patrons whispered over mugs of ale about the possibility of posthumous communication, their voices dropping to conspiratorial tones whenever strangers approached. Shopkeepers paused mid-transaction to relay the latest rumors, embellishing aspects of the letter's content or the timing of their discovery. Children, overhearing fragments, carried them home, repeating what they had heard with a mix of awe and fear. What began as a private curiosity rapidly became a social phenomenon, leaving few untouched by the story's reach. The letters, in a sense, became agents of social contagion, spreading unease and fascination in equal measure. The reactions of individuals were as varied as the interpretations of the letters themselves. Some dismissed the reports outright, declaring them to be pranks or forgeries designed to provoke attention. Others, particularly those with a predisposition toward superstition or belief in the supernatural, viewed the events as confirmation of forces beyond human understanding. The urban population, already attuned to stories of ghosts, omens, and apparitions, found the narrative easily integrated into their worldview. Every account, no matter how mundane, was scrutinized for signs that the deceased had indeed communicated from beyond the grave. Among the families living near the man, a sense of unease settled in almost immediately. Windows were left closed against imagined drafts, footsteps were paused upon hearing an unexpected sound, even familiar sounds, creaking floors, distant church bells, were interpreted through the lens of the extraordinary. Husbands and wives whispered about the implications late at night, uncertain whether to treat the letters as serious warnings or elaborate hoaxes. These domestic reverberations created an emotional tension that spread outward, influencing neighbors, extended family, and acquaintances. The letters became more than text on paper, they were catalysts for collective anxiety, shaping the atmosphere of entire streets and neighborhoods. The city's social hierarchies also played a role in amplifying the whispers. Clergy, scholars, and civic officials were drawn into the narrative, their opinions and reactions lending credibility to the tale in the eyes of ordinary citizens. Sermons in churches touched upon the mysterious events, framing them as moral lessons, divine tests, or warnings against pride and hubris. Public meetings and informal gatherings featured heated debates, pitting rational explanation against faith, skepticism against superstition. The multiplicity of perspectives only deepened the tension, ensuring that the story could not be easily dismissed and that it remained a central topic of conversation for weeks. Amidst this social ripple, individual testimonies began to take on extraordinary significance. Servants recounted faint whispers and footsteps in empty corridors, neighbors described fleeting Shadows, and visitors claimed to feel an unsettling presence in the house. Each account, regardless of credibility, added to the growing mythology surrounding the man and his letters. Contradictions were noted but often overlooked in favor of the more sensational details. The layering of testimony created a cumulative effect, amplifying the sense of unease and anticipation. People began to see patterns and intentions that may not have existed, interpreting ordinary events as signs of something far greater and far darker. Fear, once subtle, gradually became a tangible presence in the community. Individuals altered their routines, taking different routes home, avoiding certain streets, or choosing to visit neighbors less frequently. Conversations were tempered with caution, children were instructed not to inquire too deeply about the letters, and servants hesitated to share their observations openly. The city itself seemed to respond to the mounting tension, fog became more oppressive in perception, shadows more threatening, and the ordinary sounds of daily life, dogs barking, church bells ringing, carts rolling over cobblestones, took on a sinister resonance. Edinburgh, in its densely packed streets and tight-knit neighborhoods, became a city alive with whispered fear. The whispers also created social pressure to conform to belief or skepticism. Those who expressed doubt were viewed suspiciously by the more credulous, while skeptics criticized and marginalized those who accepted the letters at face value. Friends and family members found themselves caught between opposing social currents, unsure whether to heed the warnings suggested by the letters or to align with rational explanation. This tension fractured relationships and heightened the psychological impact of the phenomenon, ensuring that the story affected both the public sphere and the private lives of those closest to the man. As the narrative continued to circulate, embellishment became inevitable. Every retelling introduced slight variations, timing, phrasing, even the number of letters, until no single version could be considered fully reliable. Yet this unreliability did not diminish the letter's power, if anything, it enhanced it. The uncertainty, the ambiguity, and the inability to discern fact from exaggeration created a persistent psychological tension. People felt compelled to witness, interpret, and discuss the events, all while knowing that a complete understanding was likely unattainable. The letters had become a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and superstitions of Edinburgh itself. By the end of this section, the audience is aware of the growing societal impact of the letters. The story is no longer confined to a single individual or household, it has spread across neighborhoods, social classes, and even public institutions. The whispers among neighbors establish a network of observation, rumor, and fear, providing the psychological and social context that will amplify subsequent events. The stage is set for the conflict between skepticism and belief, reason and superstition, which will dominate the unfolding narrative. The letters, now a central object of obsession, begin to shape the city's collective consciousness, turning ordinary spaces into sites of anticipation, dread, and the unsettling sense that the impossible might indeed be true. As the letters continue to circulate, a powerful wave of skepticism arose from both religious authorities and prominent members of Edinburgh society. Clergy viewed the posthumous communications as a challenge to established doctrine, and many feared that acknowledging them could undermine faith in the Church. Sermons began to address the situation, framing the letters as either a test of morality, a distraction from spiritual devotion, or the work of mischievous individuals seeking attention. Parishioners were instructed to resist the temptation of sensationalism, to view the documents as tricks or illusions, and to remain steadfast in their adherence to rational faith. This created tension within households, as family members debated the legitimacy of the letters and their implications for both morality and belief. Prominent scholars and intellectuals joined the debate, emphasizing rationalism and the scientific method as tools to evaluate the phenomenon. Letters, they argued, were most likely fabricated either by someone within the household or by an external party seeking notoriety. This faction sought to apply careful scrutiny, analyzing handwriting, ink composition, paper age, and historical context. Despite their efforts, the more detailed aspects of the messages, personal observations and predictions, remained difficult to reconcile with forgery or coincidence. As a result, skepticism persisted in the public eye, but it was increasingly mingled with curiosity and doubt. People began to wonder whether rational explanation alone could account for the letters' accuracy and timing. The conflict between religious authority and rational investigation heightened social tension. Ordinary citizens were caught between two opposing forces: the reassurance offered by the Church, which demanded skepticism, and the compelling details presented in the letters, which seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Some families sided with religious guidance, dismissing the phenomenon entirely, while others clung to the possibility of supernatural communication, fearful that ignoring the signs could have moral or spiritual consequences. This divide permeated daily life, influencing conversation, social gatherings, and community interactions. Friends and neighbors who once interacted comfortably now hesitated to discuss the letters openly, aware that disagreement could provoke tension or ostracism. Religious denouncement was particularly forceful because it carried social weight. Ministers reminded congregations that the dead do not communicate with the living, that only divine authority permits true revelation, and that any attempt to interpret such messages outside of sanctioned doctrine was both dangerous and sinful. These sermons, delivered in echoing church halls and small parish rooms, resonated deeply with listeners, blending fear with moral instruction. At the same time, they inadvertently heightened interest in the letters, as humans are often drawn to that which is forbidden or dismissed by authority. The paradox created a social environment where skepticism and fascination coexisted, amplifying anxiety while fueling relentless speculation. Outside the Church, scientific voices provided alternative frameworks for understanding the letters. Investigators and amateur scholars examined every detail, hypothesizing explanations that ranged from elaborate hoaxes to psychological projection. They suggested that the man may have prepared the letters in advance, anticipating his death, or that subconscious influence could have guided posthumous discovery. Others proposed more radical ideas: cryptographic encoding, secret messengers, or early forms of delayed communication. Despite their technical analysis, no conclusive evidence emerged, and the tension between skepticism and possibility remained unresolved. The letters, in essence, became a test case for reason itself, challenging Edinburgh's intellectual and moral institutions alike. Among ordinary citizens, the interplay between skepticism and religious denial created confusion and fear. Some dismissed the letters as nonsense, only to find themselves haunted by coincidences or unexplained events that mirrored their contents. Others attempted to reconcile the letters with faith, treating them as a moral or divine warning, yet struggled to explain how communication could occur after death. Families experienced stress as arguments over belief intensified, and individuals wrestled with private fears that were magnified by public discourse. Even those not directly connected to the deceased felt the psychological weight of the controversy, as rumors, speculation, and social judgment permeated the city. This tension also extended to the media. Newspapers and pamphlets reported the letters with varying degrees of skepticism and sensationalism, often framing events as either scandalous fraud or ominous portent. Public debate became heated, with letters to the editors and opinion pieces reflecting polarized views. Readers, whether motivated by curiosity or fear, were drawn deeper into the narrative, following each development with heightened interest. The effect was a city caught in a feedback loop: the more public discussion grew, the more intense private speculation became, and the more people felt compelled to weigh the possibility of supernatural or extraordinary intervention. Within the household, the letters' effects were particularly pronounced. Family members were divided between belief, skepticism, and fear. Some clung to the idea that the letters were a deception, attempting to rationalize every detail through mundane explanations. Others were convinced of their authenticity, interpreting them as direct communication from the deceased. This internal division caused strain and discord, echoing the broader societal conflict between reason and faith. Emotional responses ranged from outright panic to obsessive scrutiny, illustrating how the letters' influence extended beyond simple curiosity into psychological and moral territory. The combination of religious authority, public skepticism, and media attention created an environment where the letters' mystery was amplified rather than diminished. Attempts at rationalization were constantly challenged by the detailed and personal nature of the messages. Clergy admonished parishioners to ignore the letters, scientists and investigators analyzed them for logical explanation, and citizens reacted with fear, fascination, and moral anxiety. The result was a citywide atmosphere of tension, in which every observation and interpretation carried weight, and every rumor or coincidence added to the mounting sense of uncertainty. By the conclusion of this section, the letters had become more than an individual curiosity, they were a battleground for conflicting ideologies. Skepticism and religious denial had collided, drawing the attention of the entire community and exposing the limitations of both faith and reason. Ordinary citizens, scholars, clergy, and family members all grappled with the implications, setting the stage for further escalation. The psychological and social pressure would continue to mount, preparing the audience for the next phase of the story, the multiplication of letters, the intensifying obsession, and the unraveling of both perception and societal norms. The tension between doubt and belief, reason and superstition, had firmly entrenched itself at the heart of Edinburgh, ensuring that the mystery could not be ignored or easily resolved. As time passed, the initial letter was no longer an isolated incident. New messages began to surface, each more elaborate and detailed than the last. They arrived in similar handwriting, carefully composed and signed in a manner unmistakably belonging to the deceased man. Each letter contained observations that only he could have known, along with cryptic references to events, objects, and individuals within the household and the city at large. The meticulous nature of the writing, combined with the uncanny specificity of the contents, left recipients in a state of growing unease. Every new letter seemed to confirm the impossible, that the dead were somehow communicating with the living. The town reacted with a mixture of fascination and fear. Neighbors, scholars, and clergy alike gathered to read, discuss, and attempt to interpret the messages. Some letters were mundane in appearance, referencing the man's habits, favorite objects, or uncompleted tasks. Others were disturbing, hinting at secrets, moral failings, or potential misfortunes awaiting the living. This juxtaposition between ordinary and extraordinary content created a layered tension, compelling individuals to pay close attention while simultaneously inciting dread. Each letter seemed designed to provoke a psychological response, drawing the living into an intricate web of curiosity, anxiety, and speculation. Among family members, the letters became a source of obsession. Some pored over every word, searching for hidden meaning or instructions, believing that failure to understand them could bring misfortune. Others recoiled from the correspondence, fearing that reading them too closely might somehow invite harm. The household's daily routines began to revolve around the arrival of new letters, their timing, and the interpretation of cryptic phrases. Tension between family members intensified, as disagreements over authenticity and intent led to arguments, accusations, and quiet suspicion. What had begun as curiosity now evolved into a consuming psychological pressure that dominated the household atmosphere. The public reaction amplified the effect further. Townspeople, hearing about the letters through rumor or in person, speculated on their origin. Some posited that they were the work of a skilled forger, someone exploiting grief and curiosity for attention. Others feared a supernatural intervention, asserting that the deceased man's spirit had found a way to reach beyond death. These interpretations varied widely, often reflecting the personal beliefs, biases, and fears of those recounting the events. Yet regardless of interpretation, all were united by a shared sense of the letter's significance and the impossibility of their existence. Edinburgh, already steeped in folklore and superstition, became a city engaged in collective speculation, with conversations dominated by the content and implications of the correspondence. The letters themselves were diverse in tone and content. Some contained personal anecdotes, reflections on past interactions, or subtle guidance intended to influence decisions. Others were warnings, often cryptic, suggesting danger or moral consequence for certain behaviors. Scholars and investigators attempting to analyze the letters noted patterns, careful structuring, deliberate word choice, and consistent handwriting style. Despite exhaustive examination, no explanation fully accounted for the letter's content, timing, or precision. For the public, this combination of verifiable detail and enigmatic message created a sense of inevitability, as though the deceased had planned each communication to ensure maximum impact. As the letters multiplied, so did the anxiety surrounding them. People began noticing coincidences that mirrored the contents, reinforcing belief in their authenticity. A phrase predicting a minor accident, for example, would be recalled after a misfortune occurred, interpreted retroactively as confirmation. Ordinary events took on extraordinary significance, and subtle patterns were magnified in importance. This phenomenon spread across households, neighborhoods, and social circles, heightening emotional intensity and creating a citywide sense of anticipation. Individuals became attuned to minor details, overanalyzing interactions, sounds, and occurrences in search of connections to the letters' warnings or guidance. The letters also became a topic of scholarly debate. Experts in cryptography, handwriting analysis, and emerging fields of psychology examined the messages in painstaking detail. Hypotheses were proposed, ranging from elaborate forgery to subconscious influence on those handling the letters. Some investigators suggested that the man had meticulously planned every detail before death, leaving instructions designed to manipulate perception after his passing. Others entertained more fantastical explanations, considering the possibility of posthumous communication or intervention by unknown forces. No single theory could account for the totality of evidence, leaving debate unresolved and adding to the growing sense of mystery and tension. Within Edinburgh, media coverage expanded the letter's reach. Newspapers reported on new discoveries, interviews with family members, and speculative commentary from clergy and scholars. Editorials debated the social, moral, and intellectual implications of the phenomenon, while readers wrote in with personal experiences or interpretations. This exposure ensured that the letters were no longer confined to private correspondence; they had become public property, shaping social discourse and influencing the city's collective consciousness. The effect was to elevate the mystery to a communal level, embedding fear, fascination, and speculation into the daily lives of citizens. Psychologically, the letters exerted profound influence. Individuals reported sleepless nights, obsessive attention to detail, and heightened emotional sensitivity. Families experienced division, as members disagreed on interpretation, authenticity, and appropriate response. The letters became a lens through which every event, every sound, and every behavior was evaluated. Ordinary occurrences were reframed to align with the predictions or messages within the correspondence. This relentless focus intensified anxiety and obsession, leaving few untouched by the growing sense of unease. By the end of this period, the letters had multiplied sufficiently to dominate life in Edinburgh. They were no longer simply documents, they were instruments of influence, shaping perception, behavior, and social interaction. The combination of personal specificity, cryptic warning, and apparent foreknowledge created an environment in which rational explanation seemed insufficient. Citizens, family members, and scholars alike were compelled to grapple with the letter's implications, even as they struggled to maintain skepticism or reasoned judgment. The multiplication of letters thus escalated the story's tension, reinforcing the sense that something beyond ordinary comprehension had entered the city. Ultimately, the proliferation of letters marked a turning point in the narrative. What began as a single enigmatic document had become an unfolding phenomenon, touching every level of society, from intimate family dynamics to public discourse. Anxiety, curiosity, and fascination intertwined, creating a psychological landscape as dense and layered as the fog-covered streets of Edinburgh itself. The audience is drawn into this environment, fully aware that the mystery is deepening, that ordinary life is being transformed by extraordinary events, and that the letter's influence is spreading beyond anyone's control. The stage is set for escalating conflict, obsession, and the unraveling of perception that will define the next chapters of the story. In response to the growing mystery of the letters, scholars, physicians, and early psychologists sought to impose order on what seemed an impossible phenomenon. The posthumous messages challenged the boundaries of contemporary knowledge, prompting investigations that ranged from meticulous scientific analysis to speculative theorizing. Experts examined handwriting, ink composition, and paper quality, attempting to uncover evidence of forgery or manipulation. While physical analysis confirmed that the materials were consistent with 1871 standards, it offered no explanation for the content itself, which included personal details, observations of events in the household, and cryptic predictions. Every detail was scrutinized, yet rational explanations fell short, leaving investigators with an uneasy sense that the letters might operate beyond the known limits of human possibility. Medical professionals of the time proposed psychological explanations, suggesting that the letters could have been produced through the influence of a highly disciplined and meticulous mind anticipating posthumous discovery. Some theorized that the deceased man had meticulously prepared the messages in advance, encoding instructions, warnings, and observations with foresight and precision. Others suggested that the letters might reflect subconscious communication, a projection of the writer's inner anxieties and premonitions, intended to manipulate the perception of those left behind. This line of reasoning relied on the assumption that the human mind could operate in ways not yet fully understood, bridging conscious intention and future knowledge. Psychologists of the era, influenced by emerging theories of the mind, examined the social and emotional impact of the letters. They noted that the family and neighbors were reacting in ways consistent with heightened suggestibility and anxiety. The unusual content, combined with the anticipation of new correspondence, created conditions under which ordinary events were interpreted as significant and aligned with the letter's messages. Dreams, faint noises, and minor accidents were retrospectively connected to the content, reinforcing belief in their authenticity. This phenomenon, they argued, demonstrated the mind's tendency to seek patterns and meaning, even where coincidence or chance might suffice. Occultists and those interested in supernatural study offered alternative explanations. They posited that the man's spirit might be reaching across the boundary between life and death, communicating through physical mediums, cryptic ciphers, or ethereal channels. While these explanations were often dismissed by scholars and the clergy, they gained traction among a subset of the population already predisposed to supernatural belief. The letters were thus viewed through multiple lenses, scientific, psychological, and mystical, each offering partial understanding while leaving significant questions unresolved. The coexistence of these competing explanations heightened both curiosity and unease, as individuals grappled with the impossibility of reconciling all perspectives. The scientific community also explored the possibility of trickery or conspiracy. Investigators considered the potential involvement of servants, acquaintances, or external parties who might have sought to exploit grief and curiosity. Handwriting analysis, careful observation of the household, and monitoring of letter deliveries were conducted to detect deception. Yet no evidence of fraud emerged. Every letter displayed consistency in style, content, and timing that seemed nearly impossible to fabricate without intimate knowledge of the deceased's life and habits. The absence of tangible manipulation left the scientific and skeptical communities in a state of frustration, facing a mystery that resisted conventional methodologies. The letters themselves became case studies in analytical reasoning. Each communication was dissected for internal consistency, symbolic meaning, and predictive value. Scholars noted subtle patterns, including repetition of phrases, deliberate structuring, and attention to detail that suggested intentional planning. Some letters contained moral instruction, others offered observations on behavior, and a few hinted at events that had yet to occur. The cumulative effect of these communications created a layered puzzle, requiring interpretation across temporal, psychological, and social dimensions. The interplay between personal specificity and cryptic generality made straightforward explanation impossible, further fueling both scholarly investigation and popular fascination. The interplay of rational and mystical interpretation created intense debate. Clergy dismissed supernatural speculation as heresy or delusion, while rational scientists sought evidence to confirm or disprove forgery. Meanwhile, members of the public oscillated between fear, fascination, and disbelief. Ordinary citizens attempted to reconcile their observations with the conflicting authorities, often turning to personal intuition or experience when conventional logic failed. The letters thus became a fulcrum for contested understanding, a site where science, psychology, and belief collided. The ambiguity reinforced the letter's power, drawing attention to the limits of knowledge, the malleability of perception, and the complex interplay between reason and emotion. The letter's predictive elements further challenged contemporary understanding. Certain passages referenced events in the household and the city that had not yet occurred or were unknown to observers at the time of writing. When these events transpired, believers cited the accuracy as proof of extraordinary insight or supernatural influence. Skeptics struggled to account for the apparent coincidence, debating whether confirmation bias, selective memory, or other psychological phenomena could explain the outcome. The inability to reach consensus deepened social anxiety, amplified debate, and strengthened the letter's status as objects of fascination and fear. Investigators also considered the broader implications of the letters. If communication beyond death were possible, it would challenge both scientific and theological foundations. Rationalists feared the destabilization of knowledge, while clergy worried about the erosion of moral authority. Families and neighbors faced personal dilemmas, whether to heed the letter's content, dismiss them, or attempt independent interpretation. The letters had become more than documents, they were catalysts for reflection, anxiety, and speculation at every level of society. Each new analysis and theory contributed to a growing sense of intrigue, tension, and moral complexity. By the end of this section, the audience understands the multifaceted attempts to explain the letters. Scientific, psychological, and mystical theories collide, none providing complete resolution. Rational investigation is thwarted by the letter's specificity and timing, while mystical interpretation is constrained by social and intellectual skepticism. The stage is set for deeper psychological impact, as family, neighbors, and scholars navigate fear, fascination, and moral uncertainty. The tension between knowledge and belief, reason and imagination, continues to escalate, ensuring that the mystery remains unresolved and increasingly compelling. The letters, once simple communications, now operate as instruments that challenge perception, test intellect, and unsettle the human psyche, preparing the narrative for the isolation, obsession, and emotional collapse that will follow. As the letters continued to arrive, the man's family and closest associates found themselves drawn into an escalating cycle of anxiety and obsession. The home, once a place of relative normalcy, became a center of tension, where every sound, shadow, and movement was scrutinized for signs that might correspond to the mysterious messages. Family members grew increasingly insular, avoiding visitors and withdrawing from social gatherings. Neighbors noted that the household had become eerily silent, punctuated only by whispered conversation and the rustle of papers. The physical and psychological isolation reinforced the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, a phenomenon that existed beyond ordinary comprehension. Daily life was consumed by the anticipation of new letters. Each family member became preoccupied with interpreting messages, identifying hidden meanings, or preparing responses they believed might be required. Conversations became dominated by speculation, analysis, and worry. Sleep was often disrupted, as dreams reflected the anxieties provoked by the letters, blending memory, fear, and anticipation in ways that left individuals exhausted and emotionally fragile. The household's routines, once orderly and predictable, were now dictated by the rhythm of the correspondence, creating a temporal structure that was both oppressive and inescapable. The psychological toll on the household was profound. Individuals exhibited heightened sensitivity to minor disturbances, a creaking floorboard could signal a warning, a flickering candle a portent. Emotions ran high, oscillating between hope, fear, and frustration. Arguments broke out over interpretation, authenticity, and appropriate response, fracturing relationships and deepening isolation. The household became a microcosm of uncertainty and tension, where rational discussion struggled to coexist with fear and obsession. Even servants and occasional visitors felt the oppressive atmosphere, often leaving quickly or declining to engage with the household for fear of involvement in matters beyond their understanding. Beyond the home, the city of Edinburgh began to respond to the letter's growing influence. Neighbors speculated about the family's state, some with sympathy, others with curiosity or fear. Rumors circulated regarding the content and implications of the correspondence, intensifying social pressure and increasing the sense of scrutiny on the household. As the letters multiplied, isolation became both a physical and social condition. Families withdrew from public life, avoided communal gatherings, and restricted interactions to only the most essential encounters. The household's retreat from society created a feedback loop, where anxiety and obsession reinforced isolation, which in turn magnified the letter's perceived significance. The man's former acquaintances and scholars who had attempted to analyze the letters reported difficulty maintaining objective distance. Visits to the home became infrequent, and interactions were brief and formal, as observers sensed the tension that had permeated every aspect of domestic life. Friends and colleagues noted that the family appeared consumed by the letters, their behavior increasingly erratic and their attention entirely focused on the messages. This observation fueled public speculation. If rational and educated individuals were so thoroughly affected, what did that imply about the letters themselves? The isolation of the household mirrored a broader psychological phenomenon, where attention and expectation amplified perception, transforming ordinary events into extraordinary experiences. Within the home, daily activities were framed by the anticipation and analysis of the letters. Meals, chores, and correspondence with external contacts were all subordinated to the priority of reading, interpreting, and reacting to each new communication. Objects mentioned in the letters were scrutinized, moved, or displayed according to perceived instructions. Instructions that were ambiguous were debated endlessly, often producing conflicting interpretations and emotional tension. The domestic environment, once a site of comfort and familiarity, became charged with a sense of surveillance and expectation, as though the deceased's presence lingered, shaping behavior and perception through the letters themselves. The psychological isolation extended to the family's relationship with the broader community. Fear of judgment, misunderstanding, or ridicule discouraged engagement with neighbors, clergy, or scholars. The letters' influence created a sense of exclusivity. Only those directly involved were considered capable of understanding or acting upon the messages. This perceived responsibility intensified emotional stress, reinforcing the household's withdrawal from social life. Every sound from the street, every knock at the door, became a potential threat or communication, further heightening vigilance and anxiety. The boundary between public and private life blurred, with the letters dictating the family's attention, priorities, and interactions with the world beyond their walls. The relentless accumulation of correspondence drove the household into deeper obsession. Each letter, while providing information, also posed new questions, instructions, or warnings, creating an ongoing cycle that demanded constant attention. The family's cognitive and emotional resources were exhausted by the effort to interpret and act upon every nuance. Sleep deprivation, emotional volatility, and obsessive focus eroded resilience, making it increasingly difficult to maintain perspective or rational judgment. The letters' influence extended beyond mere communication, functioning as instruments that shaped thought, behavior, and perception. By the end of this section, the audience witnesses the full psychological and social consequences of the letters' arrival. The household has retreated into isolation, both physically and emotionally, while the outside world observes with fascination and apprehension. The stage is set for the next escalation, the letter's effect on mental stability, the deepening obsession, and the eventual unraveling of perception. The narrative demonstrates how an extraordinary phenomenon, when internalized and magnified through expectation, anticipation, and repeated engagement, can transform ordinary life into a landscape of tension, fear, and psychological suspense. The descent into isolation not only intensifies suspense but also prepares the audience for the impending collapse and unresolved consequences that will define the next chapter. The death of the man did not bring closure, instead, it marked the beginning of a prolonged period of uncertainty, reflection, and uneasy quiet within Edinburgh. The letters, though fewer in number following his passing, had already left an indelible imprint on the city, the household, and the individuals who had interacted with them. Family members, once preoccupied with deciphering each message, now faced a void where anticipation had been constant. The absence of new letters created a strange silence, one that felt heavier than the letters themselves, as though the pause in communication was itself a message, deliberate and haunting. The psychological impact lingered, manifesting as residual anxiety, hypervigilance, and a heightened sensitivity to ordinary events. The household struggled to return to normalcy, though the sense of disruption persisted. Rooms that had been meticulously arranged to mirror instructions or references in the letters were gradually abandoned to disorder. Family members attempted to resume routines disrupted by obsession, yet ordinary life seemed muted, as though the extraordinary intrusion of the letters had permanently altered perception. Conversations often circled back to recollection, speculation, and interpretation of past communications. Even in the absence of new messages, every sound, shadow, or coincidence was examined for potential significance, reflecting the depth of psychological imprint left by the phenomenon. Outside the home, neighbors and acquaintances maintained a wary distance. Many had observed the family's previous isolation and noted the obsessive engagement with the letters, which created a sense of caution and even fear. Rumors continued to circulate, now blending fact, memory, and imagination. Those who had previously been skeptical were forced to reconcile the accuracy and impact of the letters with their expectations of reason and logic. The city, in effect, had absorbed the mystery into its social consciousness, leaving traces in conversations, local lore, and community memory. Edinburgh itself, dense with narrow streets and fog-laden alleys, seemed to retain an echo of the tension that had once dominated the household, a subtle, lingering atmosphere that made ordinary life feel slightly charged with anticipation. Scholars and clergy, having debated and investigated the letters extensively, now reflected on their conclusions and failures. Some conceded the limitations of contemporary knowledge, admitting that certain aspects of the letter's content and timing defied rational explanation. Others maintained skepticism, attributing remaining mysteries to coincidence, selective memory, or posthumous interpretation. Religious authorities, having initially condemned belief in the letters as potentially heretical, now emphasized moral reflection and caution, framing the events as lessons in humility, vigilance, and the limits of human understanding. Even in their restraint, they acknowledged the extraordinary influence the letters had exerted over both the family and the community. The broader public, meanwhile, treated the letters as an enduring enigma. In newspapers, journals, and oral tradition, stories persisted regarding their content, authenticity, and implications. Tales of predictions, warnings, and precise observations were recounted in households, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes restrained, but always retaining a sense of fascination and fear. Citizens debated, retold, and speculated, often blending the letters' narrative with local history, folklore, and personal experience. The event transcended the immediate household, becoming part of Edinburgh's cultural memory, a story that lingered in public imagination long after the original messages had ceased. Psychologically, the aftermath revealed the lasting effects of obsession and anticipation. Family members displayed persistent hypervigilance, heightened emotional sensitivity, and difficulty distinguishing between ordinary coincidence and meaningful signal. Daily life required constant cognitive effort to ignore or reinterpret experiences that might otherwise have been trivial. Even those who consciously attempted to distance themselves from the letters found their perceptions subtly shaped by past engagement, evidence of the profound influence of the phenomenon on thought patterns, expectation, and emotional response. The letters' effects were neither temporary nor fully controllable, they had altered the mental landscape of those involved in ways that would endure indefinitely. The household's reputation, too, remained complicated. Neighbors' accounts, mixed with rumor and speculation, painted a portrait of a family profoundly affected by the letters, at once sympathetic, curious, and wary. Social interactions were cautious, as acquaintances navigated the delicate boundary between engagement and intrusion. Scholars continued to reference the household in discussions of the phenomenon, while others treated it as a cautionary tale about the perils of obsession, credulity, and the unknown. The lingering silence following the cessation of letters became almost a character in its own right, shaping perception, expectation, and social behavior across multiple spheres of influence. The city's cultural memory preserved the tension, ambiguity, and fascination surrounding the letters. Folklore, oral recounting, and local writing treated the story as a hybrid of history and legend. Scholars catalogued details, archivists preserved the letters themselves, and local storytellers wove narratives that blended truth with interpretation. The letters' enigmatic nature ensured their endurance, providing ongoing material for reflection, debate, and speculation. The boundaries between fact, memory, and myth became blurred, yet the influence of the letters remained tangible, shaping collective perception and cultural consciousness well beyond their original arrival. Even in isolation, the family experienced moments of reflection and unease. Memories of the letters, once overwhelming in their immediacy, now emerged as latent echoes, resurfacing unpredictably in dreams, conversations, and observation of ordinary events. The emotional intensity remained, though mediated by time, creating a complex psychological landscape in which memory, anticipation, and residual fear coexisted. These lingering effects underscored the letters' enduring power, demonstrating that their influence was not merely in their physical presence but in the profound psychological and social networks they had activated. By the end of this section, the audience perceives the depth and complexity of the aftermath. The letters, though no longer arriving, have left a permanent mark on individuals, households, and the city itself. Isolation, speculation, and psychological imprint persist, creating a landscape of subtle unease and enduring curiosity. The stage is set for the final exploration of unresolved questions, the search for meaning, and the lasting legacy of the phenomenon. The narrative emphasizes that closure may be unattainable, and that the impact of extraordinary events often extends far beyond the immediate moment, shaping perception, behavior, and collective memory for generations. The lingering silence, more potent than any message, demonstrates the enduring power of mystery, anticipation, and the unknown in human experience. Despite exhaustive investigation, debate, and speculation, the mystery of the letters remained unresolved, leaving the city of Edinburgh with more questions than answers. Scholars, clergy, and ordinary citizens alike struggled to reconcile the events with reason, faith, and observation. The letters' precise content, timing, and posthumous origin defied conventional explanation, creating a persistent tension between skepticism and belief. Some maintained that the letters were the product of meticulous pre-planning, executed with extraordinary foresight. Others argued that supernatural intervention must be considered, despite the impossibility of proof. The lack of resolution ensured that the phenomenon remained a focal point of curiosity, speculation, and psychological intrigue long after the last letter had been received. The family, whose lives had been dominated by anticipation and obsession, continued to grapple with the letter's implications. Memories of past correspondence lingered, coloring perception and emotional response. Ordinary events were sometimes interpreted in the context of what might have been predicted, leading to recurring anxiety and reflection. Discussions within the household often returned to unanswered questions, whether more letters had been prepared and lost, whether some messages had been misinterpreted, or whether the entire phenomenon was part of a larger, unknowable design. This ongoing engagement demonstrated the letters' enduring psychological influence, even in the absence of new material or external confirmation. Public fascination persisted, fueled by both the letters themselves and the social dynamics they had set in motion. Citizens recounted events, debated authenticity, and speculated about the deceased man's intentions. Newspapers continued to reference the case in discussions of unusual events, moral lessons, or historical curiosities, embedding the letters within the broader cultural consciousness. Oral tradition ensured that even those not present during the original events remained aware of the mystery, often encountering it as a mixture of fact and folklore. The letter's legacy became a shared narrative, shaping social memory, imagination, and collective speculation for decades to come. The unanswered questions surrounding the letters created fertile ground for intellectual inquiry. Scholars revisited evidence, analyzed surviving correspondence, and debated interpretations. Hypotheses ranged widely. Some proposed psychological explanations, emphasizing human susceptibility to suggestion, anticipation, and pattern recognition. Others focused on historical and social context, considering the letters within contemporary beliefs, superstitions, and domestic life. A smaller group entertained metaphysical explanations, speculating on posthumous influence, spiritual communication, or phenomena beyond ordinary perception. The multiplicity of frameworks highlighted the limits of knowledge and underscored the letter's capacity to challenge assumptions about reality, communication, and human understanding. Even modern observers are drawn to the case precisely because of its ambiguity. The letters offer a rare intersection of personal specificity, cryptic content, and posthumous timing, compelling consideration of questions that extend beyond history into philosophy, psychology, and epistemology. What does it mean for a message to be truly posthumous? Can foresight, planning, or subconscious projection account for such precision? Is it possible that human perception, memory, and interpretation played a role in shaping the apparent accuracy of the communications? Each question opens further lines of inquiry, demonstrating how the letters operate as a stimulus for reflection on the nature of knowledge, belief, and uncertainty. The eerie legacy of the letters also manifests in cultural memory. Stories, local accounts, and folklore treated the letters as emblematic of the unknown, the uncanny, and the limits of human understanding. They became symbols of anticipation, obsession, and the unsettling intersection between life, death, and communication. Households and communities recounted the events with varying emphasis on morality, rationality, or supernatural possibility, ensuring that each retelling preserved the tension between skepticism and belief. In this way, the letters transcended their original physical form, becoming an enduring narrative artifact, capable of shaping thought and imagination long after the events themselves. Psychologically, the case underscores the lasting impact of extraordinary experience. Those directly affected, family members, neighbors, and witnesses, exhibited persistent awareness of the letter's significance, even years after the last correspondence. Ordinary perception remained subtly altered, coincidences were interpreted with suspicion, minor disturbances became meaningful, and reflection on past events was colored by the letter's content. The phenomenon illustrates how human cognition integrates, magnifies, and interprets experiences in ways that endure beyond the initial encounter, creating a form of psychological legacy that parallels cultural memory. In examining the broader implications, the letters challenge assumptions about control, communication, and the temporal boundaries of human influence. They suggest that deliberate actions, whether executed before death, imagined posthumously, or interpreted through collective perception, can resonate across time, shaping behavior, thought, and social dynamics long after the originator is gone. The ambiguity surrounding origin, authenticity, and intent reinforces the mystery, compelling ongoing engagement and reflection. Individuals, communities, and scholars find themselves repeatedly drawn back to the case, seeking meaning, coherence, or insight where certainty may be forever elusive. The unresolved nature of the letters also serves as a meditation on human curiosity and the limits of understanding. The tension between the desire for rational explanation and the pull of the inexplicable generates a sustained psychological and cultural fascination. Each unanswered question, whether about authorship, method, or intention, functions as a focal point for imagination, fear, and speculation. The letters, by resisting final interpretation, ensure that engagement remains active. They are not artifacts of the past alone but living prompts that continue to challenge perception, provoke inquiry, and unsettle expectation. By the end of this section, the audience is left with a complex and layered sense of the letter's enduring impact. The physical correspondence may have ceased, but their influence persists across psychology, culture, and intellectual inquiry. Edinburgh, its citizens, and the family at the center of the phenomenon continue to grapple with ambiguity, uncertainty, and the subtle power of anticipation. The letter's legacy demonstrates that certain mysteries, once introduced, cannot be fully contained, resolved, or forgotten. Their unresolved nature ensures that they remain potent instruments of reflection, suspense, and fascination, leaving a haunting impression that lingers long after the immediate events have passed. The narrative closes on a note of quiet unease, underscoring the profound human fascination with the unknown, the uncanny, and the questions that refuse to be answered. Years after the last letter had been received, the phenomenon continued to resonate throughout Edinburgh and beyond, leaving a legacy that blurred the lines between history, legend, and psychological intrigue. Scholars, historians, and curious observers revisited the case repeatedly, each interpretation layering new meaning upon the previous accounts. The deceased man's letters had begun as a private, intimate communication, but through the interplay of social curiosity, fear, and speculation, they had expanded into a citywide enigma. The enduring fascination lay not merely in the content of the letters but in the impossibility of their existence, messages composed with intimate knowledge, arriving after death, and challenging every assumption about communication, foresight, and human understanding. The family, who had lived at the heart of the mystery, remained shadowed by the events long after their immediate emotional turmoil had subsided. For generations, they recounted the story, preserving a detailed memory of the letters, their content, and the anxiety they provoked. Memories of anticipation, obsessive analysis, and psychological strain became interwoven with ordinary recollection, creating a tapestry in which reality and perception were inseparable. Family members noted that even decades later, ordinary occurrences, coincidental accidents, unexpected letters, or faint noises, rekindled echoes of past fear and fascination. The letters' influence had transformed the way they engaged with the world, shaping attention, interpretation, and expectation. Edinburgh itself retained a subtle yet persistent atmosphere shaped by the letters' legacy. Local historians and storytellers wove accounts of the man and his correspondence into the city's cultural memory. Narrow streets, fog-laden alleys, and the stately facades of homes became imbued with a sense of latent mystery, each shadow or echo potentially connected to the extraordinary events of 1871. Neighborhoods where the letters had been circulated were remembered for the anxiety and fascination they had provoked, with subsequent generations hearing stories that blended fact, rumor, and imagination. The city became a living repository for the psychological and social reverberations of the letters, a place where memory and myth coexisted, and where ordinary perception was subtly colored by the extraordinary. Scholars continued to debate the letters' origin, content, and implications well into the 20th century. Theories ranged from meticulous pre-planning by the deceased, to psychological projection, to supernatural influence. Each framework provided partial insight, yet none offered comprehensive resolution. Handwriting analysis, historical documentation, and forensic examination of surviving letters suggested authenticity, but could not explain the posthumous precision and predictive elements. Psychologists examined the social and cognitive impact of the letters, considering how anticipation, anxiety, and obsessive attention shaped perception and memory. Philosophers speculated on the nature of communication across time and mortality, using the letters as a lens through which to explore epistemological boundaries. The enduring absence of certainty ensured that each generation returned to the case, compelled to revisit its unresolved questions. The letters' psychological effects persisted not only within the family but across the broader community. Those who had interacted with the household or witnessed the phenomenon reported lasting unease and fascination. Ordinary events continued to be framed through the lens of anticipation and potential significance. The letters had conditioned perception, creating a heightened sensitivity to coincidence, timing, and pattern. Individuals reflected on past experiences with new attention, often connecting trivial events to the extraordinary communications they had observed decades prior. This persistent cognitive and emotional influence illustrates the profound and lasting power of the letters as instruments of psychological impact, extending far beyond their initial delivery. The interplay of skepticism, belief, and interpretation became a central aspect of the letters' legacy. Religious authorities who had once condemned belief in posthumous communication acknowledged, at least privately, the complexity of the phenomenon. Scholars and investigators who had sought rational explanations were forced to confront the limitations of their methods. Citizens who had witnessed or heard of the letters' effects grappled with ongoing questions about coincidence, premonition, and human perception. The letters had become more than a historical curiosity, they were a lens through which the limitations of knowledge, belief, and certainty were explored. Every unanswered question reinforced the tension between reason and imagination, skepticism and faith, ordinary life and extraordinary phenomena. Cultural memory ensured that the letters transcended their physical existence. Newspapers, journals, and personal accounts preserved details, often blending observation with speculation and moral reflection. Folklore and storytelling treated the letters as emblematic of the unknown, the uncanny, and the human fascination with communication beyond conventional limits. Subsequent writers and historians referenced the case as both an illustrative anecdote and a philosophical puzzle, highlighting its enduring capacity to provoke reflection on mortality, foresight, and the fragility of certainty. The letters, though tangible artifacts, had become symbols, representations of the tension between knowledge and mystery, the psychological impact of anticipation, and the human desire to understand the inexplicable. Psychologically, the enduring impact of the letters illustrates the interaction between expectation, perception, and memory. Individuals who had been exposed to the phenomenon experienced residual effects, including heightened sensitivity, obsessive reflection, and a tendency to connect ordinary events to extraordinary interpretation. Family members reported that anniversaries, minor accidents, or unexpected coincidences rekindled echoes of the letter's influence. Scholars noted that cognitive patterns established during the period of active correspondence persisted, demonstrating how extraordinary stimuli, when experienced intensely over time, create lasting psychological frameworks. The letter's influence, therefore, was not merely historical or cultural but deeply embedded in human cognition and emotion. The unanswered questions surrounding the letters fueled continued fascination. What was the true mechanism of their communication? Were they the product of meticulous planning, subconscious projection, or supernatural intervention? Did the deceased anticipate every contingency, or did coincidence and interpretation align to create the appearance of posthumous precision? Each question invites further inquiry while resisting definitive resolution, ensuring that the letters remain compelling subjects for reflection, debate, and imagination. This unresolved nature is central to their enduring power, allowing them to persist as both historical document and enigmatic puzzle. The letters' legacy also influenced literature, philosophy, and emerging scientific inquiry. Writers and thinkers referenced the phenomenon as an illustration of the uncanny, the intersection of mortality and communication, and the limits of perception. Psychologists and social theorists considered the social dynamics, obsessive anticipation, and cognitive impacts as case studies in human behavior. The phenomenon became an interdisciplinary touchstone, bridging history, psychology, literature, and philosophy. Its endurance illustrates how a single, enigmatic occurrence can ripple outward, shaping intellectual and cultural discourse across time. By the conclusion of this section, the audience appreciates the full scope of the letters' enduring influence. They were never simply private correspondence, they became instruments of psychological, cultural, and intellectual transformation. The mystery remains unresolved, and the questions they raise continue to provoke reflection and speculation. The letters' legacy underscores the human fascination with the unknown, the uncanny, and the boundary between life and death. They serve as a reminder that some mysteries, once introduced, cannot be neatly contained, explained, or forgotten. Their impact persists in memory, culture, and thought, demonstrating the lasting power of anticipation, obsession, and the inexplicable to shape human experience. The final reflection emphasizes that the letters, though anchored in a specific time and place, transcend their historical context. They exemplify the tension between certainty and doubt, reason and imagination, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Edinburgh, its citizens, and the family central to the story continue to feel the subtle influence of the letters' arrival, interpretation, and lingering presence. In this way, the mystery endures, not only as a historical curiosity but as a meditation on human perception, the limits of understanding, and the haunting power of unresolved phenomena. The narrative closes with a lingering unease, inviting contemplation, reflection, and the recognition that some questions, especially those at the intersection of life, death, and human perception, may never be fully answered, yet their influence can resonate for generations.